They say that history is written by the victors, but in the Valle del Cauca, history was buried alive. For 170 years, the San Rafael Estate has sat like a rotting monument atop a hill, its secrets locked behind the heavy cedar doors of the Mendoza Villareal family. To the world, it was a pinnacle of wealth, a kingdom of coffee and refined stone. But beneath the floorboards and deep within the red soil of the valley lies a different story, a story of a big house that wasn't just a home, but a theater of psychological warfare, forbidden alliances, and a thirst for revenge that no chain could ever hope to restrain. Today, we break the seal on the private archives of Bogota. We listen to the whispers rescued from the ruins of old manor houses. We are going back to 1847, to a time when the scent of coffee was drowned out by the stench of betrayal. This is not the history they taught you in school. This is the scandal that shattered a dynasty and unmasked the true, terrifying face of the valley. Francisco Emiliano Agua was far more than a mere laborer. He was the hidden engine that drove the prosperity of San Rafael. While Don Eduardo claimed the glory of the harvest, it was Francisco who calculated the yields and managed the complex logistics of the valley. His mind functioned like a living ledger, tracking every bag of coffee and every centavo that flowed through the Mendoza family's grasping hands. He used his position of trust to gain unrestricted access to the estate's most sensitive geographical and financial data. This knowledge allowed him to identify the exact moments when the estate was most vulnerable to a large-scale disruption. By mastering the master's tools, he ensured that the eventual collapse of the plantation would be swift and absolute. His leadership was not forged in loud proclamations, but in the quiet, heavy silences of the midnight barracks. Francisco possessed a rare, magnetic authority that crossed the boundaries of language and origin among the enslaved. He translated the complex legal rumors from Bogota into a language of hope and tactical action for his peers. Every instruction he gave was a brick in a foundation of a new society that would exist far beyond the reach of the whip. He moved through the coffee groves like a shadow, whispering a vision of a future where their labor belonged to them. His peers did not just see him as an administrator, but as the architect of a world they hadn't yet dared to imagine. The genius of Francisco's plan lay in its extreme patience and his ability to weaponize the arrogance of the Mendoza family. He played the role of the loyal servant with such perfection that Don Eduardo never suspected the fire burning behind his eyes. While he was ostensibly organizing the plantation's expansion, he was actually mapping out the secret supply caches in the mountains. He diverted small portions of grain and tools over the course of years, hiding them in caves known only to him. This logistical foresight meant that when the group finally fled, they would not be starving fugitives, but a prepared colony. He understood that a revolution without a supply chain is merely a tragedy, and he refused to let his people fail. Francisco also recognized that true liberation required an intellectual awakening that the colonial system had tried to suffocate for centuries. He spent his few hours of rest teaching the younger generation the art of calculation and the power of the written word. He knew that once a mind understands its own worth, it can never truly be owned by another human being again. By fostering a culture of literacy in the shadows, he created a cadre of leaders who could navigate the legal world. These students became his lieutenants, capable of reading the very documents that claimed they were nothing more than property. He was building a nation within the plantation, preparing his people for the heavy responsibilities of their coming freedom. When the moment of the great scandal finally arrived, Francisco Emiliano Agua did not flinch under the weight of his destiny. He stood as the bridge between the high society abolitionism of Doña Isabel and the raw, physical resistance of the fields. His calm demeanor during the violent confrontations with Don Eduardo was the ultimate act of defiance against a broken system. He proved that no amount of chains could restrain a mind that had already charted its own path to the stars. As the fires of the old world burned behind them, he led his people into the mountains with a map. That map was not drawn on paper, but etched into the very soul of a man who became a legend. Rosa Esperanza Mina was a master of a silent language that the Mendoza family could never decipher, even as they wore it on their backs. Her needles were not just tools for vanity, they were the instruments of a sophisticated intelligence network that spanned the entire valley. While the aristocrats admired the intricate floral patterns on their silk gowns, they were actually staring at topographical maps of the Cordillera. Every petal and vine was a coded symbol representing mountain passes, safe river crossings, and the location of hidden palinques. Rosa transformed the domestic space of the big house into a clandestine war room, operating in plain sight of her oppressors. She understood that in a world where her voice was silenced, her art would have to speak the truth. This covert communication system relied on the deep-rooted textile traditions that Rosa had inherited from her mother's West African ancestry. The geometry of her stitches carried the weight of ancestral knowledge, repurposed to serve the immediate needs of 19th-century resistance. A specific knot in a hem might signal the arrival of a messenger, while a sudden change in thread color warned of a militia patrol. These garments traveled from the San Rafael Estate to the salons of Cali, moving through the hands of dozens of people. Each handler was a link in a human chain that allowed information to flow faster than the owner's horses. Rosa turned the very symbols of colonial wealth into the blueprints for the system's eventual and inevitable downfall. The social mobility Rosa enjoyed as the estate's primary seamstress gave her an unprecedented level of access to the private lives of the elite. As she knelt to pin a hem for Doña Isabel, or adjusted a collar for a visiting governor, she gathered fragments of overheard secrets. She learned of troop movements, upcoming slave auctions, and the private fears of the men who claimed to own her soul. These scraps of conversation were immediately processed and woven into the intelligence reports she sent out through her embroidery. Her ability to remain invisible while being physically present allowed her to act as the primary spy for the resistance. To the Mendoza family, she was a quiet artisan. To the enslaved community, she was a legendary strategist. Managing this network required nerves of steel and a memory that could hold 1,000 different variables without a single error. One mistake in a pattern or one forgotten stitch could lead to the capture and execution of those seeking a life of freedom. Rosa lived in a state of constant vigilance, knowing that her embroidery hoop was as dangerous as any weapon of war. She taught other women in the valley how to read these patterns, ensuring the survival of the code, even if she were caught. This shared literacy of the needle created a sisterhood of resistance that the patriarchy of the time could never have imagined. They were artisans of liberty, crafting the shroud that would eventually cover the corpse of the slave system. By the time the final escape plan was set in motion in November 1847, Rosa's work had already ensured its success. The groups fleeing into the Farallones de Cali did not move blindly. They followed the silk-stitched paths she had spent years documenting. She had provided them with the tactical advantage of knowing the terrain and the enemy's movements long before they even stepped off the estate. As she packed her own needles for the final journey, she knew that her legacy was sewn into the very fabric of the valley. Her story proves that the most powerful revolutions are often born in the quietest rooms and carried out through the smallest gestures. Rosa Esperanza Mina did not just dress the elite, she used their own vanity to lead her people toward the light. The internal collapse of the Mendoza Villareal dynasty was not sparked by outside forces, but by a quiet coup within the walls of the big house. Dudo Isabel and her son, Carlos Augusto, turned the family's legal and financial foundations into weapons of mass subversion against the patriarch. While Don Eduardo obsessed over the harvest, Isabel was busy siphoning household funds and jewelry to finance the growing abolitionist underground. She utilized her status as the mistress of San Rafael to shield clandestine activities that would have otherwise led to immediate execution. By the time the scandal broke, the estate's liquid wealth had already been redirected toward the purchase of supplies for the coming escape. Her betrayal was an act of surgical precision, hollowing out the empire from the comfort of her own drawing room. Carlos Augusto provided the intellectual and political muscle needed to give their domestic rebellion a legitimate standing within the laws of New Granada. Having returned from a Europe engulfed in revolutionary fervor, he viewed his father's property as a moral stain and a terminal economic failure. He spent his afternoons in the estate office, not to audit the laborers, but to falsify records that would protect them from future reclamation. He drafted manumission papers in secret, utilizing the very legal jargon his father relied on to maintain his grip on the valley. His presence provided a vital layer of protection, as the local authorities were hesitant to question the heir to the Mendoza fortune. This father-son rift became the ultimate fracture point that allowed the light of liberty to finally pour into San Rafael. The alliance between mother and son was forged in the library, where they held literary salons that were actually high-stakes strategic meetings. Behind closed doors, they pored over the property deeds, searching for the specific legal loopholes that Isabel's dowry rights provided. They discovered that under certain conditions of marital neglect or financial mismanagement, Isabel could legally claim a portion of the estate's human capital. This was the tactical nuke they planned to detonate in the courts of Bogota to paralyze Don Eduardo's ability to sell his workers. They were not merely sympathizers, they were active combatants in a legal war, fighting to bankrupt the system they had been born to lead. Every signature they gathered was a nail in the coffin of the old world their ancestors had built. As the tension escalated, Isabel's role as a double agent became increasingly dangerous, requiring a level of cold-blooded deception that shocked her husband. She would sit across from Don Eduardo at dinner, listening to his rants about the unrest, while she had a map of the escape routes tucked into her corset. She orchestrated a series of misunderstandings with the estate's suppliers to create delays in the delivery of weapons and chains for the milita. These intentional administrative errors bought Francisco Emiliano the precious time he needed to finalize the logistical preparations in the mountains. She played the part of the dutiful, submissive wife to perfection, all while her mind was calculating the exact moment of her husband's ruin. Her silence was not a sign of weakness, but the quiet ticking of a bomb hidden under the floorboards. When the documents were finally sent to the high courts in Bogota, the internal coup was complete, leaving Don Eduardo as a king without a kingdom. The legal petitions filed by Carlos Augusto and Isabel effectively froze the estate's assets and placed the enslaved community under temporary judicial protection. This move was a masterpiece of political maneuvering, as it turned the state against the very class of landowners it usually protected. Even if the fugitives were recaptured, The Mendoza family would no longer have the legal authority to sell or punish them without government oversight. The big house had been conquered from the inside, not by fire or sword, but by the relentless application of justice. This family scandal remains a testament to the power of those who choose to dismantle their own privilege for the sake of humanity. The Midnight Academy was a sanctuary of rebellion tucked away in a forgotten corner of the mansion's second floor, where the scent of old paper masked the danger of their mission. In this hollowed-out room, the traditional hierarchy of the San Rafael Estate was systematically dismantled through the simple act of recognizing letters and numbers. Francisco Emiliano and Dodo Isabel acted as dual architects of this intellectual uprising, blending ancestral wisdom with European philosophy to sharpen the minds of the youth. They knew that literacy was the ultimate weapon, a tool that could pierce through the lies of the colonial system and reveal the inherent dignity of the oppressed. Every candle lit in that room was a beacon of defiance, illuminating a path toward a freedom that began within the mind long before the body was liberated. These children were not just learning to read, they were learning to decode the very world that sought to keep them in permanent, unthinking bondage. The curriculum of this clandestine school was a radical mixture of practical mathematics and the incendiary ideas of the Enlightenment that were then sweeping through South America. Francisco taught the older students how to calculate crop yields and interest rates, ensuring they could never be cheated in the market once they attained their liberty. Isabel provided texts that were strictly forbidden by the colonial authorities, including the revolutionary proclamations of Simón Bolívar and the early treaties on human rights. They transformed the abstract concepts of justice into tangible goals, proving that the pen could be just as effective as the machete in the fight for true emancipation. By mastering the language of their oppressors, the students were effectively stripping the Mendoza family of their monopoly on truth and administrative power. Each lesson was a strategic strike against the psychological chains that had held their families for generations in the dark. This educational underground operated under a code of absolute silence, as the penalty for teaching an enslaved person to read was a mixture of public shaming and brutal physical torture. The children were trained to hide their slates and charcoal at the slightest sound of a heavy footstep echoing in the hallway outside their hidden sanctuary. They memorized their lessons in the rhythmic patterns of work songs, turning their labor in the coffee fields into a mental exercise of historical and political recall. This mental discipline created a generation of thinkers who could communicate complex strategies right in front of the overseers without ever speaking a word of the plan aloud. The academy was a forge where the raw desire for freedom was tempered into a sharp, intellectual instrument capable of cutting through any chain. To the masters, these children appeared as mere shadows in the kitchen, but in reality, they were becoming the future governors of their own destiny. The discovery of the library by the children also meant the discovery of their own history, which had been systematically erased by the records of the slave trade. Isabel used her private collection to show them maps of the world, reorienting their place in a global struggle for dignity that extended far beyond the valley. They learned that their ancestors came from kingdoms of gold and salt, not just from the hold of a ship, a realization that restored a stolen sense of pride. This historical grounding was essential for the psychological warfare they were waging against the dehumanizing narrative of the big house and its cruel master. It replaced the identity of property with the identity of citizen, a transformation that made the physical act of escape an inevitability rather than a desperate gamble. The Midnight Academy was essentially a laboratory of the soul, where the myth of white supremacy was dissected and discarded by those it sought to diminish. When the tension reached its breaking point in late 1847, it was the graduates of this secret academy who acted as the logistical heart of the Great Escape. These young men and women used their literacy to forge travel passes and read the directional signs that led them through the treacherous mountain passes towards safety. They were able to keep detailed records of their provisions and coordinate the movement of 3 separate groups with a level of precision that baffled the local militia. Because they could read the newspapers and official proclamations, they stayed one step ahead of the government's attempts to track their movement across the rugged terrain. The Midnight Academy had fulfilled its purpose. It had created a community of leaders who were no longer afraid of the dark, because they carried the light of knowledge within them. Their success was the ultimate proof that an educated mind is the only territory that can never be truly conquered or colonized. The Great Disappearance of November 23, 1847 was a masterpiece of tactical withdrawal that left the San Rafael Estate a hollow shell by sunrise. While Don Eduardo slept, the silent machinery of the escape began to move with a precision that defied the chaos usually associated with mass flights. Over 80 people vanished into the mist of the Valle del Cauca, leaving behind only the cold ashes of their former lives. This was not a panicked scramble for the woods, but a synchronized military-style operation divided into 3 distinct and highly specialized groups. By the time the overseer's bell rang the next morning, the property of the Mendoza family had transformed into a sovereign community on the move. The silence that greeted the dawn was the loudest statement of defiance ever heard in the history of the Coffee Valley. The first group, led by the seasoned José Clemente, acted as the vanguard, carving a path through the dense, vertical jungles of the Farallones de Cali. They utilized the secret supply caches that Francisco had spent years establishing, ensuring that the elderly and the young did not falter during the ascent. Every step they took was a calculation in survival, moving through terrain that the colonial cavalry deemed impassable and treacherous. They were not merely running away, they were moving toward a pre-established sanctuary designed to be invisible from the air and the valley floor. Their movement was shielded by the very medicinal knowledge Maria Concepcion had used to heal the sick in the barracks for decades. This group represented the physical resilience of a people who had decided that the mountains were safer than the manor. Simultaneously, the second group, spearheaded by Rosa Esperanza, executed an urban infiltration into the heart of Cali to activate the abolitionist underground. They carried with them the critical intelligence and forged documents created in the Midnight Academy to secure safe passage through the city's checkpoints. Rosa used her network of contacts among the urban elite to hide her people in plain sight, utilizing warehouses and convents as temporary way stations. This group proved that the resistance was not confined to the rural fields, but had roots that reached into the very centers of colonial power. Their successful disappearance into the urban landscape paralyzed the local authorities, who could not comprehend how so many could vanish in a city of eyes. They were the ghost thread in the fabric of the valley, invisible, yet holding the entire plan of liberation together. The third group remained at the estate just long enough to ensure the legal and physical protection of Doña Isabel and her son. This group acted as a rearguard, sabotaging the estate's stables and communication lines to delay the inevitable pursuit by Don Eduardo's summoned militia. They were the ones who finally delivered the legal petitions to the regional magistrates, turning a slave escape into a complex, high-stakes judicial battle. By the time Don Eduardo could mount his horse, his legal right to his workers was already being questioned in the courts of the New Granada. This strategic delay was the final gift from the workers to their allies, ensuring that the family's internal scandal would be as public as possible. Their presence on the estate until the final hour was a psychological blow that Don Eduardo would never truly recover from. The legacy of the San Rafael disappearance remains a haunting reminder that power is an illusion that relies entirely on the consent of the governed. When the militia finally reached the mountain passes, they found nothing but empty trails and the mocking echoes of a community that had outsmarted them. The Mendoza Villareal family was left with a sprawling empire of coffee trees that no one remained to harvest, leading to their rapid financial ruin. The scandal didn't just end a dynasty, it signaled to the entire region that the age of the big house was drawing to a close. Today, the red soil of the valley still holds the secrets of that night, a night when 80 souls proved that freedom is a destination reached through courage. The Great Disappearance was the final chapter of a tragedy and the first page of a new, sovereign history for the people of the valley.